Good morning, church. This is Black History Month, and so we're talking about the interplay between the teaching of the Bible and the experience of Black people in this country. Last time, I shared with you a little bit about how I grew to understand Black History Month as a good thing. And I also shared with you how I originally came to think that the white way of doing life was normal, or even preferential. I used the term last time, white normalcy, to describe the feeling that my experience of the world was normal, even though it was distinctly different from the experience of Black people. Now, I didn't share with you why that's a problem, so I want to do a little bit of that now. First, the idea that my experience is normative does a number of things in my heart and in my mind to affect how I perceive other people. First, if my experience is normative, then I'm not really all that interested in hearing about the perspectives or experiences of people who are outside my own experience. I mean, if someone tells me about the financial plight of Black people or the glut of incarcerated Black men, my internal response is that, well, those other people live in the same world I do, and those other people have the same opportunities I have, and therefore their outcomes must be because they've made bad choices. You know, if my experience is the way the world works, then people who have a different outcome are in those conditions because of their own choices. Furthermore, if my experience is the way the world works, then I don't want to hear your sob story about how the world didn't work that way for you, because the world actually works that way. I mean, it actually works the way I think it does, doesn't it? See, if my experience of the world is normative, then you're just wrong to have a different experience. Let's go on to the second reason. The second one is that if my experience is normative, then I'm really not interested in accommodating myself or anything about me to you. I mean, if there's a cultural gap between you and me, well, it's because I'm doing it right and you're doing it wrong. I don't have to make my church more appealing to your sensibilities. I don't have to shape my language in ways that you feel more comfortable, because my way of thinking and doing things is simply correct. I'm just doing things the way they should be done, and you don't feel welcome because you're doing something wrong. Listen, I felt this consciously about the lack of Black people in my church when I was growing up. We had Black people in our town, but they didn't come to our church. And frankly, that didn't bother me. I mean, our church was doing things right, wasn't it? And if those other people didn't like it, it was because they were wrong. You know, then whenever an African American family showed up at our church, I could say to myself, see, that's proof the problem is really with the racism of the Black community against us. These people are okay with us, and they're able to fit right in, so there's clearly no problem on our side. You know, to this day, I think white people still do that quite a lot. I mean, we're often prone to finding the token Black person who shares our perspective, and then we'll point to that person to prove that they're really correct, and the white perspective is the right perspective. In fact, I should pause here just quickly to say, when I use the phrase the white perspective, a lot of people I know would react negatively against that term. They would simply say, wait a minute, this isn't the white perspective, it's just the right perspective. And that's my point. You see, thirdly, when I think of my experience as normative, it also makes me think that diversity is not a valuable concept. I mean, if any human experience is normative, then that experience is the right one. And there's really no reason to embrace any kind of diversity. If you're different from me in any way, well, you're simply wrong. The bottom line is that white normalcy is equivalent to white supremacy. Because any perspective that says I'm normal is also the perspective that says I'm right, is also the perspective that says you're wrong. So, what do you think happens when you encounter someone who's different from you, but you think of yourself as normal? Well, honestly, you have one of two options, one of two responses. Either You'll just ignore them, discount their experience, discount the other person, simply say they're not worthy of your time, they're not worthy of your relationship because you're doing it right and they're simply different, and therefore you don't have time for that. I mean, you don't want to hang out with people who are doing things wrong. You want to hang out with people who are doing things right. So your first option is just ignore them. But sadly, the second option is becoming more and more prevalent in our world. That's the option where you view the other person as somehow threatening to you. And so you decide you need to somehow oppose them. You see, that's exactly the mentality of Cain. That's what Cain did in Genesis chapter 4. Let me show you the passage. It's Genesis chapter 4, beginning in verse 1. It says this: Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I've brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. Now, Abel kept flocks and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. See, this is the moment I was talking about. Cain was born first, and he had every right to think of himself as normative. Well, I'm the way children are supposed to be. I'm the firstborn of the first man. So he had every reason to think of himself as normal, think of himself as normal, as normative. And so then he decides he's going to bring an offering to the Lord. He's the first person to make that decision too. He decides he's going to bring an offering to the Lord. So what does he bring? Well, God hadn't given any commands about sacrifice. But he had given some commands about work. See, remember when God originally created Adam and he put him in the garden? He commanded Adam to take care of the garden. And as a garden usually is, it was filled with plants. And then in the curse, God specifically commanded the man to bring forth produce from the ground at the expense of great toil. So let's just admit it. It's natural for Cain to have been a farmer. Based on everything we know, that is probably the normative way things should go. Adam was the first man, and he was told to be a caretaker of the garden, and Cain was the firstborn of the first man. And so he would most likely be a caretaker of the earth. And I bet he needed to put in a lot of effort to raise those crops. God had said it would be painful, it would be labor intensive to bring forth crops. And so for Cain, to sacrifice some of those crops would have been a real sacrifice indeed. Just compare that to Abel's sacrifice. Sure, animals require work, but not nearly as much as crops. You see, with plants, you need to till the ground, you need to plant the seed, you need to water, then you need to weed, then you need to harvest and you need to sort and do all that stuff to process what you got. But with animals, listen, you don't need to do much except make sure they don't wander off. I mean, that's mostly it. They pretty much take care of their own feeding, they take care of their own reproduction, and maybe you need to lead them to water now and then, but it's not like you have to do the same kind of work to the ground. Now, we don't know why God approved of Abel's offering and not Cain's, but we know one thing: Cain was first. And he probably thought his way was normative. And Abel was different. And that difference felt like a threat. See, this is one of the most interesting parts of the story for me. It's that clearly we are told in the story that God approved of Abel's offering, and God didn't approve of Cain's offering. But Cain isn't mad at God. He's mad at Abel. Take a look at the next verse, verse 6. It says, "Then the Lord said to Cain, 'Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you don't do what's right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. Now, I'd love to dig into the details of that verse, that whole idea of sin trying to rule over you and you ruling over it in return. But that's not the point of today's episode. Today, I simply want to point out to you that God identifies the difference between right and wrong, not us. And God opens the door to anyone to do what's right. Listen, what's normative is not determined by me. What's right is determined entirely by God. My job is just to surrender myself to Him. And if I ever learn that someone else has done something different, and if I ever learn that someone else has something right, I need to change my ways to match theirs. Furthermore, I think this is so important. Based on this, I understand that no one else's behavior is ever a threat to me. See, God looked at Cain and He said, if you do what's right, will you not be accepted? That means God is saying to Cain, as an individual, you, by yourself, on your own, if you do the right thing, you're doing the right thing. If you do the right thing, I will accept you. It has nothing to do with what Abel does. It has nothing to do with what Abel is doing. It has nothing to do with the sacrifice Abel brings. It has everything to do with God simply saying to Cain, hey, listen, it's just you and me. If you do the right thing, I'll accept you too. That's what matters. No one else's behavior determines my acceptance before God. No matter what they do, it doesn't change my relationship to God. So here are the two lessons from this story that we need to learn at this point. Number one, my experience is never normative. The determination of that belongs to God and God alone. And number two, no one else's behavior is ever a threat to me. Now, we need to finish the story because there's something I need to show you. Verse 8. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, let's go out to the field. And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, where's your brother Abel? I don't know, he replied. Am I my brother's keeper? The Lord said, what have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. Cain said to the Lord, my punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. Side note, I want to take a detour into that because that's just really fascinating. Cain believes that if he wanders away from his family, he might run into someone who will kill him. Now, think about that for a moment. Simply put, Cain believes there are people on earth outside the family of Adam. Because remember, Cain is the firstborn child of Adam. Now, I'd love to dig into the different perspectives and interpretations of this passage, but I can't do all of that in this format. All I can do is emphasize the fact that somehow Cain is thinking if he leaves his family, there are other people out there who might find him and kill him. And don't get me wrong, God actually agrees with Cain on this. Let me show you the next verse. But the Lord said to him, not so. Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And then the Lord put a mark on Cain so that no one who found him would kill him. That means that God is saying to Cain, hey, listen, I know there's going to be some people out there who when they meet you, they won't recognize you. They might consider you just a stranger, a person from a different family. They might view you as a threat because you're different from them. And so I'm going to put a mark on you so that no one who sees you will want to mess with you. Now, that means God agrees with Cain that there are other people outside the family. It's a fascinating little bit. Someday, hopefully, we'll come back to that. But verse 16. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. Now, there's a thing in that story that we need to talk about. It's the mark of Cain. Now, we don't know what it is. When I was younger, all my teachers admitted that they didn't know what the mark was. But the one speculation that came up time and time again was that the mark was darkened skin. You see, all my teachers in my Christian school and in my Sunday school presupposed that Adam and Eve had light-colored skin. And they all knew that dark-skinned people existed in the world, and they all thought that the human race was only 6,000 years old or so, which isn't enough time for skin to go from very white to very dark, and yet we know that both kinds of people are in this world. And so, as a result, from their perspective, the only way to get really dark-skinned people is if God somehow just chose to make some of them with dark skin. And this passage gave them an opportunity to see when God might have done it. Now, it wasn't just my teachers who implied that or suggested it. In fact, that's been a widely held belief for a very long time. Not necessarily to say God made Cain black, but there's some faith traditions out there that actually do believe black skin is the mark of Cain. And just because I was curious, I did a little bit of a Google image search this last week, and I looked for images from history that showed depictions of Abel and Cain in that moment when Cain is killing Abel. Now, there aren't a lot of depictions of God meeting Cain and having his conversation, but there are a lot of depictions of Cain killing Abel. And if you look at them, it is so common for Abel to have luminous white skin and for Cain to have darker skin. In fact, even in the images where Abel is lying underneath the shadow of Cain, Cain's skin is still dark and Abel's skin is still ivory or brighter white. Bottom line, the picture was put into my head that dark-skinned people were maybe descended from Cain, and that dark skin was maybe a sign of God's curse, and that dark skin was maybe the mark that says, "Don't mess with me," and that dark skin was maybe because that person is a threat. Once again, my presupposition was strengthened. The presupposition that white was right and black was somehow connected with bad, wrong, evil, the curse of God, a threat. And here's the irony. The irony is that Cain killed Abel because Abel's difference was a threat. Abel's difference put him closer to God, and that was a threat to Cain. And so Cain killed him because of his difference. And yet for centuries, white people have been persecuting black people, seeing their difference as a threat back somehow. At least in my experience, white Christians have often identified themselves with innocent Abel. And they'll share off-the-record stories about Cain being black. And by implication, black people aren't just different, they're a threat. Now, I gotta be clear, Adam and Eve were almost certainly not white. We know nothing about the color of their skin or the nature of the mark God put on Cain. And what we definitely know is that seeing yourself as normative is the attitude of Cain. So I'll reiterate the lesson we should have been taught from this passage. Number one, my experience is not normative. Determination of right and wrong belongs to God and God alone. And number two, no one else's behavior is ever a threat to me. I stand before God on my own. God would look at me and he would say, if you do what's right, will you not be accepted? I stand before God on my own. Now, thankfully, because of Jesus, I don't have to come to God on only my own merits. Because if that were the case, I'd never measure up. I'd never measure up to God's perfect standards. His norms are so much higher than mine that, first of all, any concept I have ever had in my entire life that indicates that I am somehow normative or that I am somehow the norm, any indication of that I have had is a pure egregious wrongdoing, because God is the only one who determines right and wrong. God is the only one who can determine those things, and I have fallen so far short. I have never measured up. And so as a result, I should never consider myself to be the norm in any respect, any time. Thanks be to God, He has sent Jesus to be the true norm. And that by entering a relationship with Jesus, by wrapping myself up with Christ, then I bear His merit and I approach God on that basis. He's the norm. And I just am so grateful that God's grace is such that it would allow me to come before Him and to be accepted on the merits of Christ. But listen, no one else's behavior is ever a threat to me. No one else's behavior is ever a threat to me. And because I am so frail, because I am so prone to doing the wrong thing, and because I should never consider myself to be normative, and because God is ultimately the arbiter of what is right and wrong, then I should look at this world around me and never perceive anyone else and their behavior as a threat. It should be exactly the opposite. What Cain should have done when he saw Abel is to say, wait a minute, you mean God likes that sacrifice better? You mean God wants that kind of sacrifice? Cain should have learned from Abel and done that thing, and you and I should do the same. Listen, we're going to encounter people who are different from us. We're going to encounter people with different color skin, with different musical tastes, with different cultural expressions, with different understandings of how the world works. We're going to encounter all kinds of different people from all kinds of different perspectives. And we should never consider that we're the right ones. Instead, we should say, I wonder what I can learn from them. Our approach to the differences of the people around us should be an approach of curiosity, an approach of wonder, an approach of where can I learn more about God through the experience of this other person. And so I invite you, in fact, I challenge you to be the person alongside what I'm trying to be the person who explores the differences, who learns the differences, who says to a person who's unlike you, tell me more about you, tell me more about your experience, tell me more about how you see the world, because since I am not the norm, and since you are not a threat, it's just possible that something about God is being revealed in you. And if I were to learn it, I could grow closer to God too. Listen, that's the kind of people we need to be. The kind of people who come into someone else's world. The kind of people like Jesus did for us, who would incarnate Himself into a world unlike His own, a world messed up from the way it was originally made. And He would enter into our broken places and meet us there. And we should do the same for others, because we are those broken people. And we need to learn more about God through the experiences of others as well. So join me in this journey. Join me in this journey of learning more about other people and being open to their experience of the world so that we can know more about God and how He's made us, and so that we ourselves can grow closer to Him too. If any of this has been encouraging to you, then let me encourage you to share it with someone you know. Share it with someone so that, I don't know if they're going to agree with everything that I've said or if you agree with everything that I've said, but share it with someone and let's challenge each other to be people who are more open to the differences, because we should never be like Cain, who views other people as a threat. We should be more like the people who would learn from Abel and grow and do things that would honor God because we have learned from the people around us too. If this has been encouraging, do whatever you need to do. Like it, share it, subscribe to this channel, put a comment down below, give me some feedback, let me know what it is you're thinking. Give me a better understanding of your perspective on all these things because I want to learn more. I want to learn from you, and hopefully we can be on this journey of growth together. And in the process, I bet we can grow closer to God too. So thanks so much for joining me today. God bless you.